Do you know the value of the most expensive Wild West photograph? It sold for an astonishing $2.3 million. Stick around, and I'll explain all about it at the end of the video. In this video, we're diving into the rich history of the Old West, brought to life through over 200 incredible photographs. From the rugged landscapes and bustling boomtowns to the legendary cowboys, outlaws, and pioneers who shaped the era, these images tell the story of a time like no other. Get ready to explore how people lived, worked, and survived on the frontier. Let's take a journey back to the early 1800s, when the West was a vast, untamed wilderness. This was the era of early exploration and fur traders, who were some of the first to venture into these uncharted lands. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the United States suddenly had a massive amount of new territory to explore, and it sparked curiosity about what was out there. That's when explorers like Lewis and Clark stepped in, leading expeditions to map the terrain, discover new resources, and open the door for future settlers. Fur traders, or mountain men as they were often called, were a big part of this story. These guys were tough. They lived in the wilderness, hunting animals like beavers to sell their pelts, which were highly prized for making hats and clothing. They weren't just surviving out there. They were thriving, creating trade networks that connected the West with the rest of the country and even Europe. Rivers like the Missouri and Mississippi became highways for transporting goods. But it wasn't all business. These traders often interacted with Native American tribes, learning survival skills, sharing goods, and sometimes even starting families. This cultural exchange was one of the first major connections between settlers and indigenous peoples in the region. In the 1820s, small settlements began to take root in the West as brave pioneers ventured beyond the established borders. These settlers, often traveling in small groups, built isolated cabins and started farming, hunting, and bartering to survive. Life was tough, but trade routes like the Santa Fe Trail, blazed by figures like William Becknell, became vital for goods and news, linking these remote communities to larger markets. During this time, Texas was becoming a hotspot. People like Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, led American families into Mexican territory, drawn by cheap land and opportunity, laying the groundwork for future tensions. Meanwhile, legendary mountain men like Jedediah Smith roamed the frontier, mapping new territories and sharing survival skills with settlers. These pioneers weren't just carving out homes. They were creating the foundations of the towns and communities that would define the Wild West. The 1830s saw the rise of frontier towns, small but bustling hubs that began to the west as settlers poured into newly claimed territories. These towns often grew around forts, trading posts, or river crossings and served as vital rest stops for pioneers moving further west. Places like Independence, Missouri, became major jumping-off points for westward trails like the Oregon Trail. Life in these towns was raw and rugged, with saloons, blacksmith shops, and general stores forming the heart of the community. Law and order were often handled by vigilante groups, as formal legal systems were scarce. This was the era when figures like Davy Crockett gained legendary status, embodying the spirit of the frontiersman with tales of bravery and exploration. One notable story is that of Bent's Fort, established by William and Charles Bent along the Santa Fe Trail. It became a key trading hub for settlers, traders, and Native Americans alike, symbolizing the mix of cultures and commerce that defined the frontier. The 1840s were a transformative time for the West, thanks to the discovery of gold in California in 1848. This sparked the California Gold Rush, drawing thousands of fortune seekers from across the US and even the world. Towns like San Francisco exploded in size almost overnight, transforming from sleepy settlements into chaotic boomtowns filled with miners, merchants, and opportunists. Life in these boomtowns was wild and unpredictable. Miners worked long hours in harsh conditions, often with little to show for their efforts, while saloons, gambling halls, and makeshift shops sprang up to cater to their needs. Lawlessness was common. and disputes were often settled with fists or pistols. Notable figures like Samuel Brannan made fortunes not by mining gold, but by selling supplies to the hopeful miners. A famous tale from this era is that of Levi Strauss, who arrived in San Francisco to sell durable denim pants to miners, laying the foundation for the iconic Levi's brand. Meanwhile, ghost towns like Bodie, California, remind us of the boom and bust nature of these settlements. The 1850s marked a period of rapid growth in the West as railroads began to connect distant settlements and bring more settlers into the frontier. The railroads, still in their early stages, made it easier for goods, people, and news to move across the vast region, laying the groundwork for even greater expansion in the decades to come. Towns began forming along railroad lines, turning remote areas into bustling communities. Places like Sacramento and Omaha thrived as key stops for commerce and migration. Farming also expanded, with settlers taking advantage of improved transportation to ship their crops to larger markets. Notable figures like Theodore Judah, known as the father of the Central Pacific Railroad, pushed for the construction of rail networks that would soon revolutionize the West. During this time, the iconic Pony Express rider emerged to fill the gap in communication, racing across rough terrain to deliver mail, a dangerous and thrilling job that became a symbol of frontier endurance. The 1860s saw the rise of the cowboy and the establishment of ranching culture as key elements of life in the West. Cattle ranching flourished in places like Texas, where vast open ranges provided plenty of space to graze herds. Cowboys became essential workers, driving cattle along trails like the Chisholm Trail to markets in Kansas, where they could be shipped east by rail. Life as a cowboy was rugged and demanding. They spent weeks on the trail, sleeping under the stars, braving harsh weather, and facing dangers like stampedes and outlaws. Legendary figures like Charles Goodnight, known as the father of the Texas Panhandle, pioneered cattle driving techniques, and even invented the chuck wagon to feed crews on long drives. This decade also saw the invention of barbed wire, which would later change ranching forever by ending the era of the open range. Cowboys, though romanticized as loners, often worked in teams and relied on camaraderie to survive the challenges of their work. The 1870s were a defining era for the Wild West, as frontier towns flourished and became infamous for their lawlessness, and for the legendary figures who tried to tame or exploit them. Towns like Dodge City and Tombstone became hubs for cattle drives, trade, and saloons, attracting settlers, gamblers, and outlaws alike. Outlaws like Jesse James and his gang became notorious for robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches, while figures like Billy the Kid captured the imagination with their daring exploits. These individuals often thrived in the chaos of rapidly growing towns where law enforcement was scarce. On the other side were lawmen like Wyatt Earp, Pat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok, who worked to maintain order, or at least their version of it. Stories of their gunfights and showdowns, like the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral, cemented their reputations as both heroes and controversial figures. Frontier towns were lively but dangerous, filled with saloons, brothels, and gambling halls, alongside the more respectable businesses of blacksmiths, general stores, and churches. The 1880s marked the peak of the Wild West and the beginning of its transformation into myth. By this time, frontier towns were more established, but the stories of outlaws, lawmen, and gunfights became larger than life, fueled by dime novels, newspapers, and traveling shows like Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. Figures like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made their names during this era, pulling off daring train and bank robberies that captured public imagination. Meanwhile, lawmen like Pat Garrett gained fame for bringing outlaws to justice, including Garrett's legendary showdown with Billy the Kid. Cowboy culture also hit its stride, with cattle drives continuing across the plains, though barbed wire and expanding railroads began to limit the open range. Ranchers adapted to the changing landscape, while cowboys started to take on a more symbolic role in popular culture as rugged, independent heroes of the West. The 1880s was also the decade of Wild West entertainment. Buffalo Bill Cody turned the frontier lifestyle into a global phenomenon with his Wild West shows, reenacting gunfights, Native American battles, and cowboy skills for audiences worldwide. The 1890s marked the symbolic end of the Wild West era, as the frontier officially closed, and the region transformed into a more settled and modernized part of the United States. This decade was shaped by major changes in economics, technology, and culture, all of which signaled the end of the untamed wilderness that had defined the Old West. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was no longer an open, unexplored space. Settlement had spread across the land, driven by decades of westward migration, homesteading, and infrastructure development. Railroads now crisscrossed the region, connecting once remote areas to bustling cities. Towns had grown into established communities with schools, churches, and local governments, replacing the rough-and-tumble frontier outposts of previous decades. Ranching and cowboy culture, iconic symbols of the Wild West, began to decline during this time. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s had already restricted open-range grazing, and by the 1890s, many cattle drives were no longer necessary as railroads and fenced pastures made long-distance herding obsolete. Cowboys remained important, but transitioned from their adventurous image to a more practical role on enclosed ranches. The era also saw the final chapters of resistance from Native American tribes. In 1890, the tragic Wounded Knee Massacre marked the last major conflict of the Indian Wars, as U.S. forces violently suppressed the Ghost Dance movement. This event symbolized the complete subjugation of native peoples and the end of their autonomy in the West, a sobering reminder of the human cost of expansion. Despite these changes, the 1890s were also a time when the mythology of the Wild West began to take hold. Figures like Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Oakley turned the frontier lifestyle into global entertainment with their Wild West shows, which romanticized cowboys, sharpshooters, and Native Americans. These performances and the popular dime novels of the time created a nostalgic image of the West as a land of adventure and freedom, even as it faded into history. By the end of the decade, the West was no longer a frontier but an integrated part of the United States. Farmlands, railroads, and cities replaced the wilderness, and the people who once lived on the edge of society now found themselves part of a rapidly industrializing nation. The Old West was a land of extremes, shaped by legendary outlaws and lawmen whose daring deeds and dramatic lives became part of American mythology. These figures, both infamous and heroic, brought lawlessness and justice to the frontier. Outlaws. Billy the Kid, William H. Bonney, perhaps the most iconic outlaw. Billy the Kid became a symbol of rebellion. Known for his quick draw and ability to escape capture, Billy claimed to have killed 8 men by the time he was shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. His youth, charisma, and untimely death at 21 cemented his place in Wild West lore. Jesse James. A former Confederate soldier, Jesse James turned to crime after the Civil War. He led the James Younger Gang, notorious for robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. Jesse became a folk hero for some, but his life ended in betrayal when Robert Ford, a member of his gang, killed him in 1882 to collect a bounty. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This dynamic duo led the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, notorious for their precision and daring heists. Known for robbing banks and trains, they fled to South America when pressure mounted in the U.S., where they reportedly died in a shootout with Bolivian authorities. Their adventures were so captivating they inspired films and countless stories. The Dalton Gang. Known for their boldness, the Daltons attempted to rob 2 banks simultaneously in Coffeyville, Kansas, in 1892. The heist turned into a disastrous shootout that left most of the gang dead. Their audacious crimes became part of the Wild West's most daring tales. Lawmen. Wyatt Earp. Perhaps the most famous lawman of the Old West, Wyatt Earp became a legend after the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. Alongside his brothers and friend Doc Holliday, Earp confronted a group of outlaws in Tombstone, Arizona. Though controversial in life, he became a symbol of frontier justice. Wild Bill Hickok. Known for his sharp aim and dramatic life, Wild Bill Hickok was both a scout and a lawman. His exploits in places like Deadwood, South Dakota, became legendary, but his death was equally famous. He was shot in the back while playing poker, holding what became known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. Pat Garrett. Garrett is best remembered for his role in tracking down and killing Billy the Kid. Once a friend of the outlaw, Garrett's pursuit ended with their dramatic confrontation in 1881, making him a key figure in the West's history of law enforcement. Bat Masterson. A lawman, gambler, and sports writer, Masterson served as sheriff in Dodge City, Kansas, during its heyday. Known for his cool demeanor and quick wit, he balanced maintaining order with a flair for the dramatic, earning a reputation as one of the West's most colorful characters. And now, as promised, let's talk about the most expensive photograph from the Wild West, a portrait of none other than Billy the Kid. This iconic tintype image, showing the outlaw standing with his Winchester rifle, is the only authenticated photo of William Bonney in existence. In 2011, it sold at the Brian LaBelle Old West Show and Auction in Colorado for an astonishing $2.3 million, nearly 5 times the expected price of $300,000 to $400,000. The winning bidder was energy tycoon William Koch, founder and president of the Oxbow Group. His purchase of this one-of-a-kind portrait made headlines, as it highlighted not just the mystique surrounding Billy the Kid, but also the enduring fascination with the legends of the Old West. This incredible sale underscores the immense historical and cultural value tied to the figures and stories of the frontier era.